Keanu Reeves has arrived at a small, inconspicuous auto repair shop in Los Angeles. He is there on business. His car needs some work before a long trip. Keanu is often in Los Angeles to film movies, but despite his celebrity status, he prefers to avoid large, crowded auto repair shops where he might be recognized. Today, he decided to choose a quieter place that looks simple and informal, where he might get less attention. The auto repair shop was located in the old part of the city, between houses and abandoned warehouses. This place is not drowning in luxury, but, on the contrary, looks a little shabby. But it was this simplicity that attracted Keanu. He loves such small corners of the city. Once Keanu parked the car, he got out and just stood outside, enjoying the warm air and the cityscape. Walking around such quiet areas gives him a chance to relax a little and forget about the stress of filming. It's a chance to get away from the noise and immerse himself in solitude. The look of the auto repair shop, its furnishings, and even the smell of old oil seemed to tell him that everything here would be simple, high quality, and without unnecessary fuss. Keanu expected that this would be a regular meeting, a work process like any other. He noticed a few cars parked outside the shop and a couple of customers standing by the door, talking to the mechanics. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see a Hollywood celebrity. Everything was unassuming and quiet. As soon as Keanu stepped inside, he was greeted by the familiar smell of motor oil, rubber, and metal. Keanu immediately remembered how he used to tinker with cars in his youth, admiring their mechanisms. He liked to take apart the parts and learn how everything worked, to feel the connection between man and technology that is born when you touch the engine. The garage looked just as he expected, a bit sloppy, with parts scattered across the tables and tools that were clearly used on a daily basis. It was a busy place, but without the glitz and attention to detail. Behind the counter stood a man of about 40, with a beard and a cap pulled down over his forehead. He lazily leafed through an old magazine, pretending not to notice the visitor. He was a typical mechanic who had seen hundreds of such customers and seemed to have long since lost interest in new faces. As Keanu approached the counter, the mechanic finally looked up from his magazine and looked at him with a slightly displeased expression, as if he momentarily regretted the distraction. Slowly setting the magazine down, he removed his gloves and slowly wiped them with a rag, as if to demonstrate that for him, interacting with customers was nothing more than a mandatory ritual. Then he reluctantly glanced at the car parked outside. It was an old 1969 Mustang, a car that had as many stories to tell as Keanu himself. The mechanic, however, did not seem to share this respect for the classic. He glanced briefly at the car, as if assessing whether it was worth his time at all, and shrugged indifferently. Keanu felt this cold indifference. He was faced with a man who did not care at all. There was something more to this indifference. "So what do you have there?" Jake said. His voice was flat, without interest. There was no legitimate interest or desire to help in Jake's words. It was simply a phrase designed to put the client off, without bothering with the details. Keanu explained that there was a transmission problem, hoping that the mechanic would respond with at least a modicum of interest. However, Jake was clearly indifferent, not even making an effort to understand the details. Jake's attitude was becoming increasingly clear. He was not going to waste his time on someone who, in his opinion, did not deserve attention. "The transmission, you say?" Jake said, as if it were a common pronoun and not a serious malfunction. "Well, that's always the case with these cars. When they're old, they start acting up. You might want to think about replacing it. I'm asking you to fix the car, not just tell me it's getting old." Keanu couldn't hide the slight note in his voice that hinted at irritation, but despite that, he still held himself back. Jake didn't look up, continued to casually rub his hands with a rag. His eyes were focused on something else, and it seemed to Keanu that the mechanic was talking not about the car, but about things that had long since tired him. Quickly disregarding any customer had become the norm for him. Keanu realized there was a message behind all of this. He could have walked away, he could have laughed and left it at that, but he didn't. Deep down, something was churning inside him. Was he supposed to play this game his way? Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The more he stood there watching Jake, the more he felt the tension building inside him. It was a strange feeling, the feeling of not being heard, of your problem being treated as an afterthought, of you being an inconvenience to the job the mechanic seemed to have learned to do automatically. And it was irritating. Keanu was used to attention, and in that moment, he needed it. As someone who had come to him with a common problem and wanted his problem solved. Was it the old car? Or was it his looks? Keanu couldn't help but notice Jake looking at his clothes with some doubt. Worn jeans, a t-shirt, and a leather jacket. He wasn't ready to leave. The irritation was too strong to just walk away and forget what had happened. He wondered over and over again. Why was this happening? Keanu began to realize that he wasn't being taken seriously in this shop. He was being devalued as a person. He felt like this whole situation only underscored how little chance he had of being heard and respected, even in something as simple as going to a car shop. Keanu seemed to be losing his patience. It wasn't aggression, more an attempt to resist the feeling. His gaze was becoming sharper, and he began to feel that if he didn't intervene now, the situation would simply remain frozen, and he wouldn't be able to leave without trying to change something. Then he decided it was time to act. If Jake himself wasn't willing to look into the matter, perhaps someone else would. Keanu wasn't going to leave without getting his questions answered. He wasn't used to leaving empty-handed. "I need to talk to the manager," he said, turning to Jake. His voice was confident, but there was still a bitter feeling inside. The mechanic barely noticed the change in Keanu's tone, only snorted and nodded. He clearly had no intention of interfering with this conversation, as if he thought that nothing would change now. A few minutes later, the manager entered the shop. He was a little older than Jake, and his confident but calm demeanor was immediately noticeable. He was a man who was used to being in control, and his gait betrayed experience. There was a slight smile on his face, but it was more welcoming than friendly. He approached and addressed Keanu with restraint. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" His voice was calm, but there was that slight wariness in it that you might expect from a man accustomed to being in the know and resolving conflicts. "I came here with a problem," he began calmly, looking the manager straight in the eye. "But I don't like the way I'm being treated here. I came here for help, and they told me my car was too old to take care of." The manager continued to stare at him, expressionless, but his face wasn't stony. He took a step forward to look at the Mustang again and take note of Keanu's words. It was his way of assessing the situation. "I understand," he said finally after a brief silence. "We're all doing our jobs here, but sometimes it's hard to please every customer. That's okay. However, I understand that you feel undervalued. That's not how we want to run our service." Keanu noticed that the manager's tone was completely different from Jake's. It was not just an attempt to explain the situation, but a sincere desire to understand and resolve the problem. There was not the slightest hint of dissatisfaction or irritation in the manager's voice. On the contrary, his manner was open, and Keanu felt that this man was truly willing to listen. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," the manager continued, turning to Keanu. "You're probably right. I understand how important it is to feel heard. Let's see what can be done with your car, and I'll try to help you with this issue." When the manager addressed Jake, his voice became stern, but not aggressive. He expressed his displeasure at the lack of attention Keanu was receiving. Jake quickly backed off, feeling that the situation was out of his control. He did not object, but Keanu noticed his face turn slightly red. Keanu realized that this intervention was not just a formality. The manager was committed to change, and this reassured him. He was ready to believe that things could still be fixed. "Do everything you need to do to ensure that this situation does not happen again." With that, the manager turned to Jake and began to explain exactly how to approach the car. Jake nodded silently, and the whole atmosphere in the workshop changed. Keanu felt that the manager's intervention not only changed the way he was treated, but also restored his confidence that his problem would be solved. "Thank you," Keanu said, nodding in response. "I appreciate your attention to this matter." Keanu stood back a little, watching as the situation began to change. He felt the tension slowly dissipate, but there was still a slight worry inside him. It wasn't just discontent. It was the moment when he realized he had to work hard to be heard. And even though the manager had intervened, the questions were still ringing in his head. Why is it so hard to start with respect? Why do I, as a person, have to fight for basic attention? As the manager, as confident as ever, continued his conversation with Jake. Keanu couldn't help but notice how quickly the situation was changing. Jake, who had just been full of self-confidence, stood before his boss looking visibly confused and perhaps even a little embarrassed. There was a malicious glint in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected his behavior to be so blatantly put in its place. Keanu noticed how his initial irritation began to smoothly develop into some kind of feeling of victory. Now, watching their conversation, Keanu realized that the moment had truly turned. The manager's intervention was not just a formality. The manager was speaking firmly, but with restraint. His voice was even quieter and calmer than before. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully so that everything would be constructive, but at the same time not sound like an accusation. Keanu could not help but notice how the manager, despite his calm, held absolutely all the strings in his hands. His words seemed to break the ice, and Keanu felt that now he was not alone in this situation. There were no more casual phrases or indifference. Keanu felt an invisible line of trust being built between them. He even felt that he himself, as a person, had become important to this workshop, and, what is important, to its manager. A moment later, Keanu realized that this whole situation could have been saved by simple respect from the very beginning. And now, standing here, he no longer felt like an outsider, as he had been during his first interaction with Jake. It was a feeling of being perceived as a partner in a dialogue, and not as another client whose problem could be ignored. But despite the positive changes, there was still one big question in the air. Why did it have to go this far? Keanu had never been one for conflict, but at some point, it all became part of his journey. A journey that led to the understanding that sometimes, in order to be heard, you need to make an effort, not give in to a passive attitude and go all the way. He knew that this was the moment when you shouldn't leave things to chance. The manager's intervention brought back a sense of control, but for Keanu, it was also a personal lesson. He realized that if he had been left alone in the first moment, none of this would have happened to him, but it would also have been his silent agreement that respect can be bought, not earned. Jake finally stepped back and started working on the car, but there was something different about his actions. He didn't seem as confident as he had before. It wasn't so much guilt as the realization that he had been seen and judged for his behavior. He knew that his treatment of customers wasn't just rude, it could impact the business. In that moment, Keanu realized that this wasn't just a personal victory. He was standing at the intersection of change that this shop needed. And more importantly, he was able to teach these people an important lesson, not just about how to treat customers, but how to value every person who walks into the shop. When the manager returned to Keanu with an apology and assurance that the situation had been resolved, Keanu felt the tension ease. This wasn't just justice being served. It was the realization that one meeting could change the way an entire system was viewed. "Everything is fine," the manager asked when Keanu looked at him again. "We'll sort out the car, and I'll be glad if you come back to us. We'll do everything to make sure it doesn't happen again." Keanu nodded affirmatively. He didn't add anything. He felt that words were no longer necessary. The situation was resolved, but his inner peace came not only with this decision. That moment, the realization of how little it takes to make a difference, left a deep mark on him. Keanu knew it was no accident. He'd come here to solve a specific problem, but he was also on the receiving end of something important that wasn't just about the mechanics or his own personal expectations, but about the bigger picture of how important it is to truly be heard and treated with respect. He didn't need to find ways to prove his worth or his value. He was a simple man who, like everyone else, wanted quality service and respect. And that was what mattered most. When the manager came over and offered to let him keep the car, Keanu knew this was his chance to make a move that could impact the atmosphere in the shop. He could have simply said thank you and left, but at that moment a thought awoke in him. What if he could do more than just ask for the car to be serviced? What if he could help these people see their work from a different perspective, give them a chance to truly change their approach? He felt his gaze becoming more conscious, his resentment gradually fading and his understanding coming in. Yes, he was there as a client, but his actions, his words, they could change his own attitude towards how he interacted with other people, how he perceived himself. Keanu glanced at Jake, who was still nearby, quietly working on the machine. In that moment, It became clear to him that this wasn't just an unfortunate incident to be forgotten. This was a lesson for everyone, for him and for them. Jake and his coworkers were people who probably never thought about their behavior and how it was perceived. And while Jake wasn't perfect in his attitude, Keanu felt that his intervention could be the moment that made him and the others think about their work in a new way. Sometimes, just talking to someone can change the atmosphere. "I'd like to suggest something," Keanu said, turning to the manager as he approached him again. His voice was calm, but there was a sense of determination in it. "We could organize training for the shop staff, or at least have a conversation about the importance of respect in our work. I think many of you might see things differently if you were shown how important it is for a customer to feel heard." The manager listened attentively, without interrupting, and nodded when Keanu finished. His face was serious, but in his eyes you could see a sincere intention to change the approach. "That's a good idea," he said, smiling slightly. "I'll bring it up and we'll think about how to improve customer service. Maybe we should do some kind of training. I appreciate your suggestion and the fact that you've pointed out an important aspect of the work that we might have missed." Keanu felt satisfaction rise in his chest. He knew this moment hadn't been easy, but now he felt like his intervention had been worth it. He hadn't just made people do their jobs better. He had helped them see the importance of simple human relationships, respect, and consideration. After the manager left, Keanu stood in the shop for a moment, processing what had happened. At that moment, he began to realize that his goal wasn't just to get quality service for his car. He wanted to be heard as a human being, and this situation showed him that even in the most mundane circumstances, it's important to pay attention to how we treat each other. All these little moments add up to a bigger change. He stroked his car, thinking that it was important not only to fix something physical, but also to work on improving the relationships with others. It was a meaningful lesson for him, and for all the people he interacted with that day. Keanu no longer felt helpless or ignored. He was sure that every situation could be learned and changed to his advantage. And if even such a small moment could lead to change, then there was still much room for improvement. When Keanu returned to his car, everything seemed a little different. The atmosphere in the shop had changed. The workers moved faster, more decisively, and their gazes were no longer so cold or indifferent. Even Jake seemed to be taking his job more seriously, although Keanu knew that was only the beginning. He felt a lightness again that he hadn't felt in a long time, but it wasn't enough. Despite the improvements in the staff's behavior, he still needed to take the car for a test drive. When the manager confirmed that all issues were resolved, Keanu finally got into his car and started the engine. The light, familiar hum of the engine immediately filled his ears, and he knew that this moment was truly important. Everything in this test had to end now, on the road. Keanu was in no hurry, but he decided that this test drive should be more than just moving the car along the asphalt. This was his way of saying goodbye to the situation that led to understanding. The workshop was silent. Keanu turned his car around, and Jake seemed to take a step back, allowing him to leave the area. A shadow of respect did slip into his eyes. It was the final chord that completed the melody of change. In his life, as in the life of this workshop, something that he himself could call real change was beginning to happen. Driving down the street, Keanu felt the air on his face energize him. His hands were steady on the wheel. He felt every vibration of the car, every movement. The road before him was open. He could go anywhere, anytime. But in this moment, alone in his car, he knew this wasn't just a test drive. It was the end of a certain stage of his life. He felt how every part of the car, every element of its controls, became a part of him. The technology, the metal, and the leather, all became one, merging with the feeling of freedom he found in such moments. The test drive wasn't a test for the car. It was a test for Keanu. Few could understand that it wasn't just a ride for him, but a profound moment of realization about how important the process is, from start to finish, from encountering a problem to resolving it. The freedom this ride gave him wasn't just a physical thing. It was an internal experience that cleared his mind of all irritations. Keanu thought about the importance of respect. How many people don't realize its value, taking it for granted? At that moment, he realized that his treatment of other people had to be as considerate as his treatment of this car. He knew that if something in life is broken, it won't just be fixed, it has to be given time. And he has to be considerate of every step of the process. Every turn of the wheel was like a step closer to completing this test. Every inch of the road was like an extra moment when he was freed from all the weight of the previous experience. Keanu drove through the quiet streets of the city, all the thoughts associated with this day rushing through his mind. He realized that the most important thing was not the result. Not that he achieved the test, but the moment when he realized that he had a right to respect, and he himself should give it. The freedom he felt now was the most important part of this realization. When Keanu got back to the shop, he stopped the car in front of the entrance, not rushing to get out. He sat there for a few seconds, looking out at the city, watching the traffic around him continue. He was in no hurry to get back in. It was then that he realized that this test drive was much more than just a chance to ride the car. This test drive was the end of one chapter for him and the beginning of another. And with that realization, he got out of the car and headed into the shop, knowing that this moment would stay with him for a long time. When Keanu returned to the workshop, the atmosphere was different, much lighter and less tense. People moved with confidence, their actions became clear, fast, but at the same time they seemed more conscious. Even in the workshop, you could feel that something had changed, and it was not just an external change. It was an internal transformation that they had all undergone that day. Keanu noticed how attentive they were to each client now. No false enthusiasm, just a genuine desire to help and provide quality work. Until recently, his presence only caused irritation or indifference in these people. Keanu walked up to the manager who was standing at the counter, watching the process. He saw the manager smile when he saw him. It wasn't just a smile of recognition, but a deep gratitude for being the catalyst for change. "How did it go?" asked the manager, his gaze sliding around the workshop, where the people were now working in a noticeably improved mood. "Very good," Keanu replied, nodding. "I'm glad all this has led to changes. It's clear that everyone is working with more attention." The manager looked at him with respect, and his gaze was full of sincere recognition. "Thank you for helping us look at things from a different angle," he said. "I honestly didn't expect the situation to be such a lesson for us. We all got the necessary incentive to do our job better and with greater responsibility." Keanu smiled slightly. He realized that these words meant much more than a simple thank you. The manager was sincere, and this was the key moment that showed that not only had the change happened, but that it was now part of their approach to customers. The employees of the workshop may not have always realized how important their behavior was to other people. But now they could see how small details could change not only the atmosphere of the business, but also in life. Keanu looked around. Jake, with whom he had had a tense conversation, was now working much more calmly. He no longer looked so irritated or arrogant. He was focused, his movements were more confident, but most importantly, there was no longer that arrogance on his face. He was simply a professional doing his job. Other mechanics, who hadn't even paid attention to the customer at first, now did their job with much more interest. Keanu saw them looking at their work, as if for the first time they realized its importance. Not just fixing, but caring about what they were doing. It was the moment when people began to perceive their profession not as a duty, but as something more meaningful, a kind of art. As he passed, Keanu noticed several employees chatting among themselves. Their conversations weren't the same as before, with quiet jibes or irritation at customers. They were discussing the details of the work, looking for ways to improve the process, sharing ideas on how they could work faster and better, and how important it was to understand that all of this was tied to their reputation. Keanu couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere in the workshop had changed, not only in terms of work, but also in terms of how people interacted with each other. A sense of community had replaced indifference. They began to see each other not as just colleagues, but as people who could support each other in achieving a common goal, to provide better service and improve the quality of their work. As he walked to his car to pick it up, he felt again how this wasn't just about him, but connected to a larger process. This effect of change was so profound that even if he never returned, his actions would still leave a mark on this place. And Keanu knew that this was his achievement. He could have simply left everything as it was, walked away without trying to change the situation. But he chose to act, and that action led to changes that were not superficial. "Thank you for everything," Keanu told the manager as he stood by his car. for listening, and for changing the approach. This is an important step. We will not forget you, the manager replied. I hope that we can continue to work with the same attention to each client that you showed us. Your intervention was a real lesson for us. Keanu nodded, knowing that his work here was done. He was pleased with the result. He had been part of a change that not only improved the work of this workshop, but also showed people the importance of treating everyone fairly and respectfully, regardless of their status or appearance. As Keanu left the workshop, his gaze was calm and confident. He knew that his actions had not been in vain. It was a victory not over the system, but over indifference. In the end, it was a step towards making the world around him a little more considerate and kind. It was at moments like these that he realized how important it was to remember that every little action counts. And if each of us does our part, the world will become a little bit better.